The automatic doors of Oak Ridge General Hospital whooshed open at exactly 5:47 a.m., same as every Tuesday for the past 2 years. Elena Morales' sneakers squeaked against the polished linoleum as she made her way through the maze of corridors that had become as familiar as her childhood bedroom. The hospital at dawn had its own rhythm, quieter than the chaos of day shift, but never truly silent. Monitors beeped their steady reassurances. Ventilators whispered their mechanical lullabies. And somewhere in the distance, a coffee machine gurgled to life. The small silver medallion of St. Christopher caught the fluorescent light as Elena clipped her ID badge to her scrubs. The medallion had been blessed by Father Martinez at Sacred Heart, the same church where 3 generations of Morales women had prayed for safe journeys and steady hands. Today, like every day, Elena whispered a small prayer of her own. Let me be enough. The ICU was Elena's domain, though she'd never thought of it that way when she first started. Fresh out of nursing school at 26, drowning in student loan debt and working double shifts just to keep her head above water. She'd taken the job because it paid 50 cents more per hour than the medical surgical floor. She'd expected to hate it. The constant pressure, the families in crisis, the weight of holding lives in your hands. Instead, she'd found her calling. "Morning, mija," came a whisper from room 314. Elena smiled as she approached the bed where Mrs. Rodriguez lay recovering from her 3rd surgery in 6 months. At 89, Elena Rodriguez had survived the kind of life that would have broken most people twice over. Immigrating from El Salvador with nothing but hope and determination, working 3 jobs to put her children through school, bearing a husband and a son, and now fighting a body that was finally reluctantly admitting defeat. "How are we feeling today, Mrs. R?" Elena asked, her voice soft as she checked the monitors. She'd learned early that healing happened as much in the quiet moments as in the dramatic interventions. A gentle touch, a listening ear, the simple act of seeing someone as more than just a collection of symptoms and numbers. "Better now that you're here," Mrs. Rodriguez said, her accent thick but her English clear. "You remind me of my granddaughter. She's in medical school now, wants to be a doctor like you." Elena didn't correct her. She tried explaining the difference between nurses and doctors countless times, but to Mrs. Rodriguez, anyone who wore scrubs and carried hope was a doctor. "She must be very smart," Elena said, instead adjusting the pillow behind the older woman's head. "Smart like you. I see how the other nurses look at you, how the doctors listen when you speak. You have the gift." The gift. Elena had heard variations of this her whole life, usually from her own grandmother, who insisted that some people were born with healing hands. Elena had always been skeptical of such mystical thinking, preferring the concrete reality of medical science. But there were moments like when she'd suggested checking Mr. Patterson's blood sugar 3 hours before his scheduled lab draw and caught his diabetic crisis early, or when she'd noticed the subtle change in Mrs. Kim's breathing pattern that led to the discovery of her pulmonary embolism. When she wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was something to it. "I just pay attention," Elena said, the same response she always gave. "That is the gift," Mrs. Rodriguez replied with a knowing smile. The ICU was quieter than usual this morning. Elena made her rounds, checking on each of her 6 patients with the methodical thoroughness that had become second nature. Room 312, Mr. Patterson, day 3, post-cardiac surgery. Vitals stable, but still requiring close monitoring. Room 315. Mrs. Kim, recovering from her pulmonary embolism, finally stable enough to read the romance novel her daughter had brought. Room 318, Mr. Thompson, a construction worker whose fall from scaffolding had left him with multiple fractures and a traumatic brain injury. His wife hadn't left his bedside in 4 days. And in room 320, the one that made Elena's heart clench every time she entered, was Jason Taylor, 16 years old, honor roll student, captain of his high school wrestling team, until a drunk driver ran a red light and changed everything. The impact had left him with a severe spinal cord injury, multiple surgeries, and a future that looked nothing like the one he'd planned. "Hey, stranger," Elena said as she entered his room. Jason was awake, staring at the ceiling with the 1,000-yard stare that came from too many hours of forced stillness. "Hey, Elena." His voice was flat, robbed of the enthusiasm that had made him one of her favorite patients during his first week. That was before the doctors had delivered the news about his legs, before the reality of his situation had settled like a weight on his chest. "Your dad coming by today?" Elena asked, though she already knew the answer. Jason's father worked for a security firm. His mother had passed away from cancer when Jason was 12. Mike Taylor came when he could, but bills didn't stop accumulating just because your son was in the hospital. Dad's got a big job in Aurora, but he'll be here for dinner. Jason tried to sound casual, but Elena heard the loneliness underneath. She glanced at the clock, still early enough that she could sit for a few minutes before the day shift chaos began. Want me to read some more Harry Potter? We left off right when things were getting good. For the first time that morning, Jason's face showed a flicker of interest. You don't have to. I know you're busy. Never too busy for Hogwarts, Elena said, settling into the chair beside his bed and pulling out the worn paperback copy of Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban from her pocket. She'd been reading to him for weeks now, doing voices for each character. It was silly, maybe, but it made him smile, in a place where smiles were rare currency that was worth everything. Where were we? She asked, flipping through the pages. Hagrid just got arrested, Jason said, and Elena could hear the smile in his voice. Ah, right, the dramatic part. She found the page and began to read, slipping into Hagrid's distinctive accent. I'm innocent, he called, waving his massive hands at the crowd. I'm innocent of what they have accused me of. Elena lost herself in the story in the simple act of bringing a moment of escape to a kid who needed it desperately. She didn't notice the time passing, didn't hear her phone buzzing with yet another overdue notice from her student loan company. In this moment, there was only the story, Jason's quiet laughter at her Professor McGonagall impression, and the steady rhythm of the machines that kept watch over healing bodies. It was only when she heard footsteps in the hallway that she realized how long she'd been reading. The day shift would begin soon, and she still had medications to distribute and charts to update. But as she looked at Jason's face, more relaxed than she'd seen it in days, she decided the paperwork could wait a few more minutes. One more chapter, she asked. Please, Jason said, and Elena turned the page. Outside, Oak Ridge was waking up. The sun painted the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold, and the first wave of morning traffic was beginning to fill the streets. Inside Oak Ridge General, the night was giving way to day with its own quiet rituals. Shift changes medication, rounds the eternal dance of healing that never stopped, never paused, never rested. Elena read on, her voice weaving through the familiar corridors of Hogwarts, carrying both herself and Jason away from the sterile reality of the ICU to a place where magic was real and heroes could overcome any obstacle. She had no way of knowing that in less than 8 hours she would need to find her own kind of magic, her own definition of heroism. For now, there was only the story, the steady beeping of monitors, and the simple faith that tomorrow would be better than today. The cafeteria at Oak Ridge General served food that could generously be described as edible. Elena had learned early in her career to pack her own lunch, peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, usually with an apple if she was feeling flush. But today she'd overslept her alarm clock victim to another power outage in her building, and she'd rushed out the door with nothing but a protein bar and determination. She stood in line behind Dr. Robert Davidson, the attending physician, who everyone called Doc. At 68, he was a legend in the hospital, a craggy-faced, silver-haired former Army doctor who should have retired years ago, but couldn't seem to stay away from the place. Everyone knew Doc had served as a combat medic in Korea, though he rarely spoke of it. The stories that circulated among the staff took on the quality of myths. How he'd performed emergency surgery by flashlight when the generator failed during a snowstorm in '87. How he diagnosed a rare genetic disorder just by looking at a patient's gait. Doc nodded at Elena with genuine warmth. Unlike some doctors who maintain careful professional distance from nurses, Doc treated every staff member with the same gruff respect, from the chief surgeons to the newest orderly. Long night, he asked, making the small talk that filled the spaces between their professional interactions. They're all long nights, Elena replied, which was true enough. Even when she worked days, the weight of the job followed her home. She'd lie awake sometimes replaying decisions, wondering if she'd missed something, if there was more she could have done. Her phone buzzed against her hip. Without looking, she knew what it was. Another notice from her student loan company. The amount she owed had somehow grown despite her monthly payments, some mathematical sorcery involving interest rates and administrative fees that she'd never fully understood. $847 this month, more than her rent, more than her car payment, and groceries combined. She silenced the phone and grabbed a turkey sandwich that looked only moderately suspicious. Instead of eating in the crowded cafeteria, Elena made her way back to the ICU. She had her own ritual for lunch breaks, 30 minutes with Jason reading whatever book they were working through. It wasn't technically part of her job description, but Elena had learned that healing happened in the spaces between medical procedures, in the moments of human connection that no insurance company could quantify or bill for. Jason was awake when she entered room 320, staring out the window at the Oak Ridge skyline. The Rocky Mountains rose in the distance, snow-capped and eternal, a reminder of the world beyond the hospital walls. "How's the view today?" Elena asked, settling into the chair that had become hers by unofficial designation. "Same as yesterday, same as tomorrow, probably." Jason's voice carried the weight of someone who'd been forced to confront mortality before he'd even learned to drive. "Hey," Elena said gently, "remember what we talked about, one day at a time." It was advice she'd learned from her own grandmother, who'd immigrated to America with 3 children and a suitcase full of dreams. "Mija," she used to say, "you can't carry tomorrow's problems with today's strength." Elena had been too young to understand then, but now, watching Jason struggle with a future that looked nothing like the one he'd planned, the wisdom felt profound. "Easy for you to say," Jason replied, but without malice. "You can still walk." It was a direct hit, the kind of brutal honesty that came from someone who'd lost the luxury of politeness. Elena felt it in her chest, a tightness that had nothing to do with her own problems and everything to do with the unfairness of a world where drunk drivers walked away from accidents while honor students spent months learning to navigate wheelchairs. "You're right," she said simply. "I can't understand what you're going through, but I can sit here with you while you figure it out." Jason turned from the window to look at her, really look at her, and Elena saw something shift in his expression. "You don't have to, you know. I know you have other patients." "I know, but Harry Potter isn't going to read himself." Despite everything, Jason smiled. "We never did find out what happened on the Buckbeak." Elena pulled out the book, finding their place with the ease of long practice. "Chapter 12, she announced. "The Patronus." She began to read, slipping into the familiar rhythm of Rowling's prose. Around them, the hospital continued its eternal hum. Nurses making rounds, families keeping vigil, the steady electronic symphony of machines monitoring heartbeats and breathing, and the thousand small miracles that kept bodies functioning. Elena found herself thinking about Patronuses as she read about the idea that you could conjure protection from your happiest memory. What would her Patronus be? Her graduation from nursing school, maybe, when her grandmother had cried tears of pride and her parents had finally stopped asking when she was going to find a real job. Or maybe it would be simpler. Mornings like this one, reading to a scared kid and watching some of the fear leave his eyes. "Elena," Jason's voice interrupted her thoughts. "Yeah. Do you think things happen for a reason?" It was the kind of questions that came from hospital beds, from the strange, suspended reality of being sick or injured. Elena had heard variations of it from dozens of patients over the years. "Why me? Why now? What's the point of any of it?" "I don't know," she said honestly. "I used to think so. My grandmother always said God had a plan for everyone. But then I see kids like you, good kids who never hurt anyone, and I wonder what kind of plan includes drunk drivers and hospital beds." "So you don't believe in God?" "I didn't say that. I just think maybe the plan is bigger than we can understand. Or maybe—" She paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound like empty comfort. "Maybe the plan isn't about what happens to us. Maybe it's about what we do with what happens to us." Jason considered this, his face serious in the way that teenagers' faces became when they were forced to think about adult problems. "What are you going to do with your student loans?" The question caught Elena off guard. She'd been so focused on providing comfort that she'd forgotten how perceptive Jason was, how much he noticed about the people around him. "I don't know," she admitted. "Keep paying them, I guess. Hope they go away eventually." "How much do you owe?" Elena almost deflected. It wasn't appropriate to discuss personal finances with patients, but something about Jason's genuine concern made her answer honestly. "More than I can afford. Way more." "That sucks." "Yeah, it does." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, two people bound by circumstance and the strange intimacy that developed between caregivers and patients. Elena realized she'd stopped thinking of Jason as just another case, another room number on her assignment sheet. He'd become something more, a reminder of why she'd chosen nursing in the first place. back when she'd believed that helping people heal was the most important thing a person could do. Elena, Jason said again. Yeah, thanks for reading to me. I mean, and for everything else. Elena felt something tighten in her throat. You don't have to thank me, Jason. It's what anyone would do. No, he said quietly. It's what you do. There's a difference. Before Elena could respond, her phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't the loan company. It was the hospital's internal messaging system calling all available staff to a meeting in the East Conference Room. Elena frowned, checking the time. 2:15 p.m. staff meetings were usually scheduled for shift changes, not the middle of the afternoon. I have to go, she said, closing the book and tucking it back into her pocket. But I'll be back later. Okay, we'll find out what happens to Buckbeak. Okay, Jason said. Be careful, Elena. It was an odd thing for a patient to say to a nurse, but Elena smiled anyway. Always am. She left room 320 and walked quickly toward the conference room, passing other staff members who looked equally puzzled by the sudden meeting. As she walked, Elena had the strangest feeling, like the air itself had changed somehow. It reminded her of the moments before severe thunderstorms, when the atmosphere seemed to hold its breath. She checked her watch. 2:16 p.m.? In 60 seconds, everything would change. In 60 seconds, Elena Morales would discover exactly what she was capable of when everything she'd trained for, everything she believed in, was tested in the most dramatic way possible. But for now, she was just a nurse walking down a hospital hallway, thinking about Patronuses and student loans, and the way Jason's face had lit up when she'd done her Hermione Granger voice. For now, she was still the person she'd been that morning. Dedicated, caring, but fundamentally ordinary. The conference room door was just ahead. Elena reached for the handle, unaware that she was about to step into the most extraordinary day of her life. The East Conference Room was packed by the time Elena arrived. Every chair was taken, forcing latecomers to line the walls. The energy in the room was strange, a mixture of confusion and anticipation. Elena spotted Doc Davidson near the front, his face set in the kind of grim expression she'd come to recognize as his response to administrative nonsense. Thomas Blackwell stood at the podium, immaculate in his tailored suit that probably cost more than Elena made in a month. At 55, the CEO of Horizon Healthcare Group carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to having his decisions obeyed without question. Beside him stood Dr. Victoria Hayes, the newly appointed chief medical officer, her posture rigid, her expression carefully neutral. Blackwell cleared his throat, and the room fell silent. Thank you all for coming on such short notice. As you know, Horizon Healthcare Group acquired Oak Ridge General 6 months ago with the promise to bring this institution into the 21st century. Today, we're announcing the first phase of that modernization process. Elena felt something cold settle in her stomach. In the corporate world, modernization was rarely good news for the people actually doing the work. Effective immediately, we will be implementing a new staffing model across all departments with an emphasis on efficiency and cost control. This will include a 15% reduction in full-time positions, primarily through early retirement incentives, and the consolidation of redundant roles. A murmur ran through the room. 15% wasn't a trim, it was an amputation. Additionally, we'll be standardizing care protocols to align with Horizon best practices with new metrics for patient throughput and resource utilization. The cold feeling in Elena's stomach spread. Patient throughput sounded like they were talking about widgets on an assembly line, not human beings in crisis. Finally, we'll be phasing out certain legacy programs that do not align with our strategic vision, including the Community Outreach Clinic and the Senior Wellness Initiative. Doc Davidson stood up, then his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Those programs serve the most vulnerable people in this community. He said, his voice steady but edged with anger. People who have nowhere else to go. Blackwell's smile never reached his eyes. Doc Davidson, we appreciate your passionate advocacy, but healthcare is a business that must be sustainable to continue serving anyone at all. Healthcare isn't a business, Doc countered. It's a sacred trust, something you'd understand if you had ever actually treated a patient instead of just treating spreadsheets. The room went perfectly still. No one spoke to Thomas Blackwell that way, especially not in public. Dr. Hayes stepped forward, her voice smooth as polished marble. Dr. Davidson, perhaps we could discuss your concerns privately after the meeting. So you can tell me the same thing behind closed doors. No, thank you, Dr. Hayes. I prefer my corporate doublespeak right out in the open where everyone can see it for what it is. Blackwell's smile tightened. Actually, Dr. Davidson, I'm glad you've raised this issue publicly. It allows me to share some additional news. As part of our restructuring, we've reviewed the performance and cost effectiveness of all senior staff. And after careful consideration, we've determined that your position will be among those eliminated through our early retirement program. A collective intake of breath swept through the room. Doc Davidson was Oak Ridge General. He'd been there for over 30 years, had trained half the doctors in the building, had saved more lives than anyone could count. I'm not ready to retire, Doc said simply. I'm afraid it's not a request, Doctor. It's a decision that's already been made. Your retirement will be effective at the end of this month with a generous severance package that recognizes your years of service. And if I refuse, then we'd have to consider termination for cause, which would unfortunately affect your benefits. I'm sure you'll make the sensible choice. Elena watched Doc's face, saw the muscle in his jaw tighten, saw the way his hands clenched into fists and then deliberately relaxed. She'd seen that same controlled response when difficult surgeries went wrong, when families received devastating news. It was the face of a man who had learned through decades of practice how to manage rage in the service of something greater. You'll have my decision by the end of the week, Doc said finally. Then he turned and walked out of the room, his back straight, his stride purposeful, a soldier retreating in good order rather than surrendering. The meeting continued, but Elena barely heard the rest of Blackwell's presentation. Her mind was racing, calculating the implications of these changes for her patients, for her colleagues, for herself. More patients per nurse meant less time with each one. Standardized protocols meant less room for the kind of intuitive care that had saved Mr. Patterson and Mrs. Kim. And the loss of Doc Davidson meant losing the moral compass of the entire hospital. After the meeting, Elena found Doc in the doctor's lounge, staring out the window at the mountains in the distance. He didn't turn when she entered, but his shoulders relaxed slightly, indicating he knew she was there. "They can't do this," Elena said, her voice tight with anger. "They can," Doc replied. "They own the place. That's how it works now. Medicine by spreadsheet. But you're the best doctor here. Everyone knows it. I'm also the most expensive with the most vacation time and the highest salary. And I refuse to order unnecessary tests just to pad the bottom line." He turned to face her then, and Elena saw something in his eyes that she'd never seen before. Uncertainty. "I'm not ready to stop, Elena. I still have something to give." "I know," she said. "Everyone knows. This place is changing, has been changing since Horizon took over. But this is just the beginning. Mark my words, they're going to cut and trim until there's nothing left but profit." Elena thought about Jason, about Mrs. Rodriguez, about all the patients who needed more than standardized care protocols. She thought about what healthcare looked like when it was reduced to numbers on a balance sheet. "What can we do?" she asked. Doc was quiet for a long moment, his gaze returning to the mountains. "I don't know yet, but I'll tell you this much. I've survived worse than Thomas Blackwell, and I'm not going down without a fight." There was something in his tone that made Elena believe him, that made her think of the young man who had once patched up wounded soldiers under fire in Korea, who had faced death and disaster, and somehow kept his humanity intact. "Whatever you decide to do," Elena said, "I'm with you." Doc nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement rather than agreement. "Be careful, Elena. These people don't play fair, and they have long memories." She should have been frightened by the warning. Instead, she felt a strange sense of clarity, as if a path she couldn't yet see was beginning to form beneath her feet. "Neither do we," she said, "and so do we." 3 days after the announcement, Elena was working a double shift in the ICU when she noticed something strange. Mrs. Kim, who had been stable and improving steadily, was suddenly scheduled for an additional round of pulmonary function tests and a follow-up CT scan. The orders had been entered by Dr. Hayes, directly bypassing the attending physician. Elena frowned as she reviewed the chart. Mrs. Kim's oxygen levels were good, her breathing clear, her recovery progressing exactly as expected. There was no medical justification for these additional tests, which would be both uncomfortable for the patient and expensive. She found Dr. Hayes at the nurse's station reviewing charts on the computer. The CMO looked up as Elena approached, her expression guarded. "Nurse Morales, isn't it? What can I do for you?" "It's about Mrs. Kim in room 315, Elena said, keeping her voice professional. I noticed she's scheduled for additional tests tomorrow, but her condition doesn't seem to warrant them. Dr. Hayes' smile was practiced, polished to a high gloss of condescension. I appreciate your concern, but I've reviewed her case personally and believe these tests are necessary for a complete assessment. With all due respect, doctor, she's been stable for days. Her recovery is on track. These tests seem excessive. Are you questioning my medical judgment, nurse? The way she said nurse made it sound like a lesser category of humans somewhere between pet and furniture. I'm advocating for my patient, Elena replied, refusing to be intimidated, as I'm required to do by the Nursing Code of Ethics. Dr. Hayes closed the chart she was reviewing, her movements precise and controlled. The standard of care at Horizon facilities includes comprehensive follow-up testing to ensure no complications are missed. It's for the patient's benefit. And the fact that these tests will generate additional revenue for the hospital is just a coincidence. The words were out before Elena could stop them, hanging in the air between them like a thrown gauntlet. Hayes' smile vanished. That was inappropriate, Nurse Morales. Your job is to carry out the orders as written, not to analyze the business model of this hospital. Is that clear? Elena wanted to argue further, to point out that unnecessary tests weren't just a financial issue, but an ethical one. Tests had risks. They caused discomfort. They took up resources that could be used for patients who truly needed them. But she also knew that this wasn't the right battlefield or the right time. Perfectly clear, doctor. Good. I suggest you focus on your duties and leave the medical decisions to those qualified to make them. Elena returned to Mrs. Kim's room, the conversation replaying in her mind. As she adjusted the older woman's pillows and checked her IV, she couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in the hospital she loved. It wasn't just Doc Davidson's forced retirement or the staffing cuts. It was a change in values, a reordering of priorities that placed profit above patients. That evening, she found Doc in the hospital cafeteria, sitting alone with a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. He looked older somehow, the lines in his face deeper than they had been a week ago. You look like you've seen a ghost, he said as she sat down across from him. Not a ghost, just the future, maybe. Elena told him about Mrs. Kim, about the unnecessary tests, about her conversation with Dr. Hayes. Doc listened without interrupting, his expression darkening with each detail. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. It's already happening, he said finally. The slow corruption of care. One unnecessary test at a time, one cut corner, one protocol that looks good on paper, but fails in practice. What can we do? Elena asked for the second time in as many days. Document everything. Doc said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Every questionable order, every patient who receives unnecessary treatment, every staffing decision that compromises care. Build a record they can't ignore or deny. And then what? Then we take it to the state medical board, to the press if necessary. Horizon cares about one thing above all else, their reputation with investors. Hit them there and they'll listen. It was dangerous territory. Whistleblowers rarely emerged unscathed, especially in healthcare. But Elena thought about Mrs. Kim, about Jason, about all the patients who deserve better than to be treated as entries on a balance sheet. I'll help, she said. Tell me what to look for. Doc studied her face as if measuring her resolve. It won't be easy, Elena. They'll come after you. After your license, your reputation. I know. But what's the alternative? To watch them dismantle everything that makes this place worth working in, to compromise the care we provide just so some shareholders can get bigger dividends. A thin smile crossed Doc's face, the first she'd seen since the meeting. You remind me of someone I knew a long time ago. Young Army nurse in Korea. Refused to evacuate during an artillery barrage because she had patients who couldn't be moved. Told the commanding officer to court-martial her after they survived if he still wanted to. What happened to her? Elena asked. She got a Silver Star for valor, and then she married the commanding officer. His smile widened. My late wife had a way of winning arguments, even impossible ones. It was the first time Elena had ever heard Doc mention his wife. The revelation created a new dimension to the man she'd known for 2 years, a glimpse of the person behind the professional mask. We'll need to be careful, Doc continued, his voice returning to its practical tone. Gather evidence methodically. build a case they can't dismiss as disgruntled employees with an axe to grind. Elena nodded, already mentally cataloging the instances of questionable care she'd observed in recent weeks. I can start with my department. The ICU documentation is detailed enough that patterns would be obvious. Good, focus there first. And Elena, he paused, his expression grave. Be careful who you trust with this. Not everyone will have the courage to stand up when it matters. As if on cue, Elena's phone buzzed with a notification from the hospital system. She glanced down and felt her heart sink. The preliminary staffing schedule for next month showed her hours cut by 20%, just enough to maintain her status as full-time for benefits, but not enough to cover her bills. She showed Doc the notification, her hands steady despite the panic building in her chest. It's starting already, she said. They're sending a message. Doc's jaw tightened. They're making a mistake. They think they can intimidate you into silence. Instead, they've just given you nothing left to lose. Elena thought about her student loans, her rent, the credit card debt she'd accumulated during nursing school. The practical part of her brain screamed that this was no time for moral stands, that she needed to keep her head down and her job secure. But another part, the part that had drawn her to nursing in the first place, knew that Doc was right. Some lines couldn't be crossed, not even for financial security. Some compromises cost too much, not in dollars, but in the currency of integrity. What's our next step? She asked. Doc's eyes held a fierce light that belied his age. Tomorrow we start building our case. Today you go read to Jason. Kids like him are why we're fighting in the first place. Elena nodded, understanding the wisdom in his words. The battle ahead would be long and difficult, but it would be fought in daily acts of compassion as much as in documented evidence and formal complaints. Same time tomorrow, she asked, standing to leave. Same time, Doc confirmed. And Elena, thank you for remembering what this job is really about. She walked back toward the ICU, her steps lighter, despite the weight of the decisions she'd made. Whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. And she wouldn't compromise the values that had brought her to nursing, not for Horizon, not for Thomas Blackwell, not for anyone. As she reached Jason's room, she heard voices inside. Pushing the door open quietly, she saw Mike Taylor sitting beside his son's bed. At 62, Mike was still an imposing figure, broad-shouldered and straight-backed, his military bearing evident even in civilian clothes. His hair had gone silver, but his face retained the weathered strength of a man who had spent his life in service to others. They were looking at an old photograph album, Jason pointing to a picture of his father in uniform. Is that when you were stationed in Germany? Jason was asking. Yeah, 1983, the height of the Cold War. We were watching the East German border. They were watching us, everyone pretending we weren't one mistake away from World War III. Elena started to back out, not wanting to interrupt the moment, but Mike spotted her. Elena, he said warmly, don't go. Jason was just saying you might come by to continue your book. I didn't want to intrude, she said. You're not intruding, Mike assured her. Actually, I was hoping to talk to you about Jason's PT schedule. Elena moved into the room, noticing the way Jason's eyes lit up when he saw the book in her hand. Whatever was happening with Horizon, whatever challenges lay ahead this moment, this connection was what mattered. It was why she had become a nurse. It was why she would fight to protect what healthcare was supposed to be. And somewhere deep inside, Elena Morales knew that the decisions she was making now would define not just her career, but her character. She was choosing a path that would test everything she believed about herself and about the profession she loved. The automatic doors of Oak Ridge General Hospital would continue to open at exactly 5:47 a.m. every Tuesday. But the Elena Morales who walked through them was changing, evolving into someone stronger and more determined than she had ever expected to be. Whatever came next, she would face it with courage, with integrity, and with the absolute conviction that some things were worth fighting for no matter the cost. 2 weeks after the staffing announcement, Oak Ridge General Hospital had changed in ways both subtle and profound. The corridors seemed quieter, with fewer staff rushing between patients. The cafeteria, once a hub of conversation and camaraderie, had taken on the hushed atmosphere of a library where people feared being overheard. Nurses spoke in whispers, doctors kept their heads down, and everyone moved with the cautious precision of people walking on thin ice. Elena Morales felt the changes most acutely in the ICU. With staffing cuts, her patient load had increased from 6 to 8, stretching her attention dangerously thin. The extra monitoring, the careful checks, the time spent holding a hand or explaining a procedure to a frightened family member, all sacrificed on the altar of efficiency. But it was the changes she couldn't see that troubled her most. The altered charts, the unnecessary tests, the subtle pressure to move patients through the system faster regardless of their condition. A healthcare system being slowly transformed into a profit machine, one compromised value at a time. Elena had kept her promise to Doc Davidson. For the past 14 days, she documented every questionable order, every overbooked nurse, every patient who received tests or treatments that seemed designed more for billing than healing. The evidence was mounting, a damning portrait of a hospital losing its soul. She arrived for her shift at 5:47 a.m., same as always, but the routine that had once brought comfort now filled her with dread. Each day brought new challenges, new ethical compromises, new battles between what was right and what was expedient. The familiar weight of her St. Christopher medallion against her skin reminded her of why she was still here, still fighting. For patients like Mrs. Rodriguez who trusted her with their fragile bodies. For colleagues like Doc who refused to surrender their principles. For herself and the nurse she had promised to be when she took her oath. Room 320 was her first stop. Jason Taylor had become a fixed point in her shifting world, a reminder of why the fight mattered. He'd made progress in physical therapy, regaining some sensation in his lower extremities. The doctors were cautiously optimistic about partial recovery, a dramatic improvement from their initial prognosis of permanent paralysis. "Morning, champ," Elena said, entering his room with a smile that felt more natural than any she'd managed in days. Jason looked up from the book in his lap. They'd moved on from Harry Potter to The Lord of the Rings, a journey from one magical world to another. "Hey, Elena, Dad was just here. He brought donuts." Mike Taylor's visits had become more frequent, his construction company having assigned him to a project closer to the hospital. Elena had come to appreciate the older man's quiet strength and dry humor. He reminded her of her own father, a man of few words but deep feelings whose affection showed in actions rather than speeches. "Your dad's spoiling you," she teased, checking Jason's vitals with practiced efficiency. "He says sugar is medicinal, doctor's orders." "Is that what he says? And which doctor would that be?" "Doc Davidson. He stopped by last night during his rounds." Elena paused, her hand on the blood pressure cuff. "Doc was here, making rounds." "Yeah, around 8. He's not supposed to be here anymore, is he?" Elena chose her words carefully. Doc's retirement had officially begun 3 days ago. His hospital access revoked, along with his parking privileges. If he was making unofficial rounds checking on patients after hours, he was risking more than just trespassing charges. "He's technically retired now," she said neutrally, "but I'm sure he misses his patients." "He looked at my chart for a long time," Jason continued, "asked a bunch of questions about my new medication. Seemed worried." "New medication?" Elena pulled up Jason's chart on the tablet. Sure enough, there was an order for a high-dose steroid that hadn't been there during her last shift. The prescribing physician was Dr. Hayes. "Did Doc say what concerned him about the medication?" Jason shrugged. "Something about side effects and whether the benefits outweighed the risks. Medical stuff. He wrote some notes and said he'd be back to check on me." Elena's unease deepened. The steroid in question was typically used for acute inflammation, but Jason's condition had stabilized weeks ago. The dosage was unusually high with potential side effects, including mood disturbances, elevated blood sugar, and increased susceptibility to infection. All serious concerns for someone in Jason's condition. "How are you feeling on the new medication? Any changes?" "Kind of wired, heart racing sometimes, hard to sleep." Jason's forehead creased with worry. "Is that normal?" "It can be a side effect," Elena said, keeping her voice calm despite her growing alarm. "I'm going to check with Dr. Hayes about adjusting your dosage, okay?" She completed her assessment, promising to return for their reading session during her break. As she left Jason's room, Elena felt a familiar coldness settling in her stomach. The pattern was becoming clear. Aggressive treatments, unnecessary medications, interventions that generated higher billing codes but offered questionable benefit to patients. Doc Davidson was continuing his investigation even without official access to the hospital. And if he was risking his reputation and possibly legal consequences to do so, the situation was more serious than she had realized. Elena spent the morning moving between patients, her mind divided between their immediate needs and the larger patterns emerging around her. Mrs. Rodriguez was scheduled for cardiac catheterization despite her fragile condition and the risk of complications. Mr. Thompson, the construction worker, with the traumatic brain injury, had been approved for transfer to a long-term care facility despite showing signs of improvement that might warrant continued acute care. Every case seemed to follow the same pattern. Decisions that optimize billing rather than outcomes, treatments that looked impressive on paper, but added little value for patients, and a systematic pressure to move patients through the system regardless of their individual needs. During her lunch break, Elena slipped away to the hospital chapel, a small room tucked away on the first floor. Few staff used it, making it one of the few places where private conversations remained truly private. Doc Davidson was waiting for her, his tall frame somehow diminished in civilian clothes, without the white coat that had been his uniform for decades. "You shouldn't be here," Elena said, closing the door behind her. "If Blackwell finds out you've been accessing patient records, then he'll have to explain why a 16-year-old wrestler with a spinal cord injury is receiving immunosuppressive doses of prednisone with no documented inflammatory condition." Doc's voice was tight with controlled anger. "Or why an 89-year-old woman with stage 3 kidney disease is being prepped for a procedure that could push her into complete renal failure." "Mrs. Rodriguez," Elena whispered, "I saw the orders this morning. It's not just her. I've been reviewing the cases I can access through my colleagues. The pattern is consistent across departments. Aggressive interventions, questionable medications, procedures that generate maximum reimbursement with minimal regard for patient welfare." Elena pulled out her own notes pages of documentation she'd been gathering. "I've seen the same thing in the ICU. But how are you getting access? Your credentials were revoked." A ghost of a smile crossed Doc's face. 30 years in this hospital. You think I don't have friends willing to share their login information, especially when they're seeing the same things we are?" The revelation both relieved and troubled Elena. Doc wasn't working alone, which meant others shared their concerns. But unauthorized access to medical records was a serious violation, one that could have professional and legal consequences for everyone involved. "We need to be careful," she said. "If we're going to build a case that will stand up to scrutiny, we can't cut corners or break rules ourselves." "Sometimes you have to break the rules to enforce them," Doc replied, but his expression softened at Elena's concern. "But you're right, we need to be strategic. How's Jason doing?" "Tachycardic, anxious, classic steroid side effects, and the dosage is way too high for someone his age and condition." Doc nodded grimly. "I suspected as much. Hayes has ordered similar regimens for 3 other young patients, all with long-term recovery trajectories. The common denominator, insurance plans with excellent prescription coverage. So they're essentially being used as profit centers. That's exactly what they're being used as. And it's going to stop." Elena heard the steel in his voice, the same resolute tone that had made him a legend in the OR. Robert Davidson had survived combat in Korea, had built a distinguished medical career, had faced death and disaster with unflinching courage. Thomas Blackwell and Horizon Healthcare had no idea who they were dealing with. "What's our next move?" she asked. "We continue gathering evidence, but we need to accelerate our timeline. The longer this goes on, the more patients are at risk." Doc pulled out a small notebook, its pages filled with his precise handwriting. "I've identified 27 cases in the past 2 weeks that show clear patterns of medically unnecessary intervention. With your ICU documentation, we're approaching the threshold for a credible complaint to the state medical board." "Will that be enough?" Horizon has deep pockets and a lot of political connections. "That's why we need more than just clinical documentation. We need financial records showing the correlation between these interventions and increased billing. Proof that the decisions are driven by profit, not medical necessity." Elena felt her heart rate increase. "That's not information I have access to." "No," Doc agreed, "but I know someone who does." Before he could elaborate, Elena's phone buzzed with a hospital alert. She checked the screen and felt her blood go cold. "Code Blue ICU Room 320, Jason." She was running before the words fully registered, Doc Davidson right behind her, years of medical training, overriding any concern about his unauthorized presence. They reached the ICU in minutes, pushing through the gathering staff to Jason's room. The scene inside was controlled chaos. Dr. Hayes stood at the foot of the bed, barking orders as nurses administered CPR to Jason's motionless form. The cardiac monitor showed a dangerously erratic rhythm, his oxygen saturation plummeting, despite the supplemental oxygen being administered. "What happened?" Elena demanded, moving immediately to assist. "Apparent anaphylactic reaction," Dr. Hayes replied without looking up. He was fine 1 minute, then complained of throat tightness and collapsed. Doc Davidson stepped forward, his authority so ingrained that no one questioned his presence. "What medications has he received in the last hour?" A young nurse checked the chart. Prednisone dose at 12:30, followed by amphotericin B at 12:45. Doc's head snapped up. "Amphotericin, for what indication?" Dr. Hayes finally registered Doc's presence, her expression hardening. "Dr. Davidson, you are not authorized to be in this hospital, let alone this unit. Security will escort you out." "Answer the question," Doc demanded, ignoring the threat. "What was the indication for amphotericin in a 16-year-old trauma patient with no documented fungal infection?" Elena continued assisting with resuscitation efforts, but her mind was racing. Amphotericin B was a powerful antifungal medication with serious potential side effects, including anaphylaxis. It was typically reserved for life-threatening fungal infections, which Jason had shown no signs of developing. "We noted suspicious infiltrates on his morning chest X-ray," Dr. Hayes replied, her voice tight. "Given his immunocompromised state from the steroids, fungal pneumonia was a concern." "Bullshit," Doc said flatly. "I reviewed his films last night. His lungs were clear." "The findings were subtle. Now please leave before I call security." The cardiac monitor beeped as Jason's rhythm stabilized, the emergency medications taking effect. His oxygen levels began to rise, the crisis receding, but not yet resolved. "I'm staying with my patient," Elena said firmly, positioning herself beside Jason's bed. "He's not your patient right now," Dr. Hayes countered. "You're being reassigned effective immediately. Nurse Wilson will take over." "On what grounds?" "Insubordination and violation of chain of command. You've been observed sharing confidential patient information with unauthorized personnel." Hayes nodded toward Doc. "That's grounds for immediate disciplinary action." Elena felt the room spin slightly, the implications of Hayes's words sinking in. They were being watched. Their investigation hadn't been as discreet as they thought. And now Jason had nearly died from a medication he never should have received, and she was being removed from his care precisely when he needed her most. "This isn't over," Doc said quietly to Hayes. "Not by a long shot." Security arrived, two uniformed officers who looked uncomfortable with their assignment, but determined to carry it out. Doc Davidson allowed himself to be escorted from the unit, his dignity intact despite the humiliation of being removed from the hospital he had served for 3 decades. Elena remained until Jason was stabilized, his breathing normalized, and his consciousness returning. As she prepared to transfer his care to Nurse Wilson, she leaned close to Jason's ear. "I'll be back," she promised. "Stay strong." His eyelids fluttered, not quite conscious, but responding to her voice. It was enough for now. It had to be. Outside the ICU, Elena found herself surrounded by colleagues, their expressions ranging from sympathy to discomfort to outright fear. Word traveled fast in hospitals, and everyone had heard about Dr. Hayes's accusations. No one spoke directly, but their sidelong glances and hushed conversations told her all she needed to know. She had been marked, branded as a troublemaker, a threat to the new order. Her phone buzzed with a message from hospital administration directing her to report to HR immediately. Elena squared her shoulders, took a deep breath, and headed toward what she knew would be another battle in an increasingly dangerous war. The Human Resources Office was located in the administrative wing, as far from patient care as it was possible to get while still being in the same building. The stark contrast between the sterile corporate environment and the human messiness of the medical floors always struck Elena as symbolic of the divide between those who managed healthcare and those who actually provided it. Thomas Blackwell himself sat behind the desk alongside the hospital's HR director, a thin woman named Melissa Patel, whose expression suggested she'd rather be anywhere else. The CEO's presence indicated the seriousness of the situation. They weren't just disciplining a nurse, they were making an example. "Nurse Morales," Blackwell began without preamble, "you've been observed violating multiple hospital policies, including sharing confidential patient information with unauthorized individuals, questioning physician orders outside proper channels, and creating a hostile work environment through your persistent challenges to established protocols. Elena remained standing, refusing the chair they'd offered. I've advocated for my patients as I'm ethically and legally required to do. If that conflicts with the Horizon's protocols, the problem lies with the protocols, not with my nursing practice. Blackwell's smile never reached his eyes. Your dedication is admirable but misplaced. Modern healthcare requires teamwork, adherence to evidence-based protocols, and respect for the chain of command. Your actions demonstrate a concerning pattern of insubordination and poor judgment. My actions demonstrate a commitment to patient welfare above all else, Elena countered, something that seems increasingly rare in this hospital. Melissa Patel cleared her throat nervously. Ms. Morales, given the seriousness of these violations and your unwillingness to acknowledge them as such, we have no choice but to terminate your employment, effective immediately. The words hung in the air between them. Elena had expected suspension perhaps, or reassignment to a less critical unit. Termination was the nuclear option designed to remove her completely from the equation. On what specific grounds, she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Blackwell slid a document across the desk. Violation of patient confidentiality, insubordination, failure to follow established protocols, creating a hostile work environment. The details are outlined in your termination letter. Elena didn't touch the paper. And if I refuse to sign, that's your right, Patel said, but it doesn't change the outcome. Your employment is terminated regardless. Your final paycheck will be processed within the standard 2-week period, minus any outstanding benefits reconciliation. I want it noted in my file that I dispute these allegations in their entirety, and that I believe this termination is retaliatory for my advocacy on behalf of patients being subjected to unnecessary and potentially harmful treatments. Patel looked uncomfortable, but Blackwell merely smiled. You're free to pursue whatever legal remedies you believe are available to you, Ms. Morales, but I'd advise against it. Horizon's legal team is quite thorough, and allegations against a healthcare organization of our standing would require substantial evidence to avoid being considered defamatory. It was a threat, thinly veiled but unmistakable. Pursue this, and we'll bury you. Elena met his gaze without flinching. I'll need to collect my personal belongings, she said. Security will escort you, Blackwell replied. Standard procedure for terminated employees. The humiliation of being watched while emptying her locker, of having her badge confiscated, of being escorted from the building like a criminal, these were designed to break her spirit, to ensure she left defeated and demoralized. But as Elena walked through the hospital corridors one last time, she found herself thinking not of her own situation, but of Jason, of Mrs. Rodriguez, of all the patients who remained under Horizon's care. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Outside, the Colorado sky stretched endlessly blue above the mountains, the beauty a stark contrast to the turmoil within her. Elena took a deep breath of cold, clean air, letting it clear her head. Then she pulled out her phone and dialed Doc Davidson's number. They fired me, she said when he answered. I know, Doc replied, his voice grim but unsurprised. Mike Taylor just called me. He's pulled Jason out of Oak Ridge against medical advice. They're transferring him to University Hospital downtown. Is Jason okay? He's stable. The reaction was severe but caught in time. No permanent damage, thankfully. Mike's furious. Wants to sue the hospital. Elena leaned against her car, suddenly exhausted. They'll bury him in legal proceedings for years. Horizon has the resources to drag it out until he gives up or goes broke. Maybe, but Mike's not the type to back down easily. Neither are we. What's our next move? Elena asked for the third time that day, but this time with the desperation of someone who had just lost their professional identity along with their income. Meet me at O'Malley's, 1 hour. Doc named a small Irish pub several miles from the hospital, a place unlikely to be frequented by Horizon staff. And Elena, this was always going to get worse before it got better. They've shown their hand now. That's an advantage. After hanging up, Elena sat in her car for several long minutes, letting reality settle around her. Fired. After years of dedication, of extra shifts and missed holidays, of going above and beyond for her patients. Her professional record now stained with allegations that would make finding another nursing position exponentially harder. And her financial situation precarious, even with full-time employment, was now catastrophic. Her student loans wouldn't care that she'd been fired for trying to protect patients. Her landlord wouldn't accept ethical stands in lieu of rent. Her car payment, her credit card debt, her basic living expenses, all suddenly insurmountable without income. The weight of it threatened to crush her. But then she remembered Jason's face when she'd promised to return the trust in his eyes despite everything that had happened. She thought of Mrs. Rodriguez and her unwavering faith in the gift Elena possessed. She thought of Doc Davidson, who had sacrificed his own retirement to continue fighting for what he believed was right. She wasn't alone in this fight, and she wasn't fighting just for herself. With renewed determination, Elena started her car and headed toward O'Malley's, toward whatever plan Doc had begun to formulate, toward the next phase of a battle that had suddenly become much more personal. O'Malley's was nearly empty at this hour, the lunch crowd gone, and the evening regulars not yet arrived. Doc Davidson sat in a corner booth nursing what looked like club soda, a manila folder on the table before him. But he wasn't alone. Mike Taylor sat across from him, his weathered face set in lines of barely contained fury. As Elena approached, she noticed a third man at the table, someone she didn't recognize. In his early 60s with salt and pepper hair, and the lean build of someone who spent more time thinking than eating, he had the alert, observant gaze of a person accustomed to noticing details others might miss. "Elena," Doc greeted her with a nod. "This is Richard Callahan, former FBI financial crimes specialist, current forensic accountant, and an old friend from my Army days." Callahan offered his hand. "Roberts told me about your situation. Impressive moral courage standing up to an organization like Horizon." "Not impressive enough to keep my job," Elena replied, sliding into the booth beside Doc. "Jobs come and go," Mike said gruffly. "Integrity is forever. They nearly killed my son today with their profit-driven garbage. As far as I'm concerned, you're a hero for trying to stop them." The validation warmed Elena, but didn't dispel the cold reality of her situation. Trying and failing, they're still doing it, and now we have even less access to prove it. "Not necessarily, no," Callahan interjected, tapping the manila folder. "What you've documented so far establishes a pattern of suspicious clinical decisions. What we need now is the financial connection, proof that these decisions are driven by profit rather than patient welfare." "And how do we get that without access to their financial systems?" Elena asked. Doc and Callahan exchanged glances. "That's where things get complicated," Doc admitted. "Richard has contacts at the state medical board in the Attorney General's office. They're interested in what we've found but need more concrete evidence before they can launch a formal investigation." "We need a whistleblower," Callahan explained. "Someone still inside Horizon with access to billing records, financial projections, executive communications. The smoking gun that ties clinical decisions directly to profit motives." Elena considered the staff she knew at Oak Ridge. Most were like her, clinical personnel with limited access to the business side of operations. Those who did have access were either true believers in the Horizon way or too frightened for their jobs to risk opposing Blackwell. "That's going to be difficult," she said. "The atmosphere of fear is pervasive. No one wants to be the next one escorted out by security." Mike leaned forward, his voice low but intense. "My boy nearly died today because some corporate doctor decided billing his insurance for expensive medications was more important than his actual medical needs. There has to be someone in that place with enough of a conscience to help us stop this before someone actually dies." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. They weren't just fighting against unethical business practices. They were potentially preventing deaths, protecting patients who had no idea their care was being compromised by financial considerations. "There might be someone," Elena said slowly, an idea forming. "Melissa Patel in HR. She looked uncomfortable during my termination meeting, like she knew something wasn't right but felt powerless to stop it." "Melissa," Doc repeated, recognition dawning. "She's been at Oak Ridge for 15 years, predates the Horizon acquisition. And she has access to personnel records, complaint documentation, possibly even executive communications," Elena continued. "If anyone would have evidence of systematic pressure to prioritize billing over care, it would be HR." Callahan nodded thoughtfully. "Approaching her would be risky. If she reports back to Blackwell, then we're no worse off than we are now," Doc finished. "But if she's as uncomfortable with Horizon's practices as Elena suspects, she could be the ally we need." "I can reach out to her," Elena offered. "Woman to woman away from the hospital. She might be more willing to talk to me than to any of you." The men exchanged glances, a silent communication that spoke of military training and shared experiences. Finally, Doc nodded. Be careful, he cautioned. These people have already shown they're willing to destroy careers to protect their profit margin. They won't hesitate to go further if they feel truly threatened. I understand the risks, Elena said, but what choice do we have? Every day this continues, patients like Jason are endangered. Mike's hand tightened around his glass. My son is safe now, but how many others aren't? How many families are trusting these people with their loved ones, not knowing that profit comes before patient welfare? The question needed no answer. They all knew the stakes, understood that what had begun as concern over individual cases had evolved into something far larger and more significant. They were challenging not just Horizon Healthcare Group, but an entire approach to medicine that prioritized revenue over healing. Callahan opened the manila folder, revealing pages of financial data and clinical documentation. Let's review what we have so far. Robert's clinical observations, Elena's ICU documentation, and the preliminary financial analysis I've been able to conduct based on publicly available information. For the next 2 hours, they pored over the evidence-building connections between suspicious clinical decisions and their financial implications. Elena's nursing perspective provided context for the medical choices, while Callahan's financial expertise illuminated the profit motives behind them. Doc and Mike contributed their own observations, creating a comprehensive picture of a healthcare system increasingly divorced from its foundational purpose. It's enough to raise serious questions, Callahan concluded, but not enough for the Attorney General to move against the corporation with Horizon's resources and political connections. We need internal documents, communications that explicitly connect clinical protocols to revenue targets. So we're back to needing a whistleblower, Elena said. Yes, and soon. My contact at the medical board tells me Horizon is planning to implement these same protocols across all their facilities nationwide. What's happening at Oak Ridge is just the test case. The implications were staggering. Horizon operated dozens of hospitals across the country, serving millions of patients. If the practices they'd observed at Oak Ridge were replicated system-wide, the potential harm was incalculable. I'll contact Melissa tomorrow, Elena decided. Suggest meeting for coffee somewhere public but private enough for a real conversation. And if she refuses, Mike asked, then we find another way in. There's always another way. Elena's determination surprised even herself. 2 months ago, she had been focused on her own patients, her own problems, her own small corner of the healthcare world. Now she was part of something much larger, a fight with the implications beyond anything she had imagined when she first noticed those questionable orders in Mrs. Kim's chart. As they prepared to leave, Doc pulled Elena aside, his expression grave. There's something else you should know. The state nursing board received a complaint today alleging violations of professional standards. 3 guesses who filed it. The cold feeling returned to Elena's stomach. Blackwell. Hayes actually, but same difference. They're going after your license, Elena. Not content with firing you, they want to ensure you can't practice anywhere else either. The news should have devastated her. Without her nursing license, the past 6 years of education and training would be rendered worthless. Her student loans would remain, but her ability to repay them would vanish. Everything she had worked for, sacrificed for, would be erased with a stroke of the nursing board's pen. Yet instead of fear, Elena felt a strange calm resolve settle over her. They were escalating because they felt threatened, because the evidence she and Doc had gathered was significant enough to warrant destroying them professionally. Let them try, she said quietly. The same documentation that shows their unethical practices also demonstrates my adherence to nursing standards. They can't have it both ways. Doc studied her face, seeing perhaps the transformation that had occurred over the past weeks. The idealistic young nurse he had mentored was still there, but tempered now by adversity, strengthened by moral clarity. No, he agreed, they can't, but they'll try anyway. Be prepared. Outside, the afternoon had given way to evening, the mountain air turning crisp as the sun began its descent behind the Rockies. Elena hugged Mike, shook hands with Callahan, and embraced Doc before they went their separate ways, each carrying a piece of their shared mission forward. As she drove home, Elena found herself thinking about Patronuses again, about the protective force conjured from one's happiest memory. Her Patronus wouldn't be a memory now. It would be this moment, this commitment to something larger than herself. This absolute certainty that some battles must be fought regardless of personal cost. Her apartment felt smaller than usual, the walls closing in as she contemplated her new reality. Unemployed, under investigation by the nursing board, fighting a corporation with resources she could barely comprehend. The odds seemed insurmountable, the potential consequences devastating. Yet as Elena prepared for bed, she felt strangely at peace. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles, new risks. But it would also bring the opportunity to stand for something that mattered, to make choices that affirmed rather than compromised her values. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Elena opened it cautiously, then felt her breath catch. Jason settled at University Hospital. He asked about you, says he misses your reading sessions. We all owe you a debt we can never repay. Whatever you need in this fight, you have my full support. Mike Taylor, attached, was a photo of Jason looking pale but alert in his new hospital room, giving a thumbs up to the camera. The simple gesture brought tears to Elena's eyes, a reminder of why this fight mattered, why the risks were worth taking. She slept soundly that night, more soundly than she had in weeks. Whatever came next, she would face it, knowing that her choices, however difficult, had been the right ones. Morning brought a new message, this one from Doc Davidson. Meeting with Richard, significant developments, call when you can. Elena dialed immediately, still in her pajamas, coffee unmade. What's happened? She asked as soon as Doc answered. Richard's contact at the Attorney General's office came through. They're willing to open a preliminary investigation based on the evidence we provided, but they need more. Internal documents, executive communications, something that explicitly connects clinical protocols to profit motives. So nothing's really changed. We still need a whistleblower. Yes, but now we have the weight of a potential state investigation behind us. If we can convince someone inside Horizon to cooperate, they'll have whistleblower protections. It was something, at least. A step forward in what promised to be a long journey. I'll reach out to Melissa today, Elena promised. See if she's willing to talk. Good, and Elena, be careful. The stakes just got higher for everyone involved. After hanging up, Elena showered and dressed with deliberate care, choosing clothes that conveyed professionalism and authority rather than her usual casual wear. Today she wasn't just an unemployed nurse. She was an advocate, an investigator, a potential catalyst for systemic change. She found Melissa Patel's personal email address through social media and sent a carefully worded message requesting a meeting to discuss concerns about recent practices at Oak Ridge General. Vague enough to provide deniability, specific enough to indicate the true purpose. The response came faster than expected, appearing in her inbox before she'd even finished her coffee. Cafe Brioso, 1 p.m. Come alone. The message's brevity and directness suggested either caution or urgency, possibly both. Elena sent a quick confirmation, then called Doc to update him on the development. Cafe Brioso is public enough to be safe, private enough for a real conversation, Doc observed. Good choice on her part. Do you want one of us nearby just in case? In case of what I doubt Horizon has hired thugs following HR directors around. Probably not, Doc conceded. But corporate desperation can take many forms. Just stay alert. Always, Elena promised. The hours until the meeting passed slowly. Elena used the time to organize her documentation, selecting examples that illustrated the pattern of questionable care without overwhelming someone unfamiliar with clinical details. She also drafted talking points, key questions designed to determine Melissa's level of knowledge and willingness to act. At 12:30, she left for Cafe Brioso, arriving early enough to secure a corner table with a view of both the entrance and the street beyond. The coffee shop was busy enough to provide anonymity, quiet enough for conversation. Perfect for what might be the most important meeting of her career. Melissa Patel arrived precisely at 100, dressed in the same conservative business attire she wore at the hospital, her expression guarded but determined. She ordered a coffee at the counter, then made her way to Elena's table, sliding into the seat with a quick glance around to ensure they weren't being observed. Thank you for meeting me, Elena began. Melissa raised a hand, silencing her. Before we start, I need to be clear. I'm not committing to anything by being here. I'm listening, that's all. That's all I'm asking for right now. Good. Melissa took a sip of her coffee, her eyes never leaving Elena's face. What exactly are your concerns about Oak Ridge? Elena chose her words carefully, aware that this initial exchange would set the tone for everything that followed. I believe Horizon Healthcare Group has systematically prioritized profit over patient welfare, implementing protocols and practices that generate maximum revenue regardless of medical necessity or patient benefit. That's a serious accusation. It is, and I have documentation to support it. Elena slid a thin folder across the table. These are just a few examples. Unnecessary procedures, excessive medication, aggressive interventions with questionable benefit but excellent reimbursement rates. Melissa opened the folder, scanning the contents with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to processing large amounts of information quickly. Her expression remained neutral, but Elena noticed a slight tightening around her eyes, a tell that the information was registering as significant. Even if these clinical concerns are valid, Melissa said finally, what makes you believe they're driven by financial motives rather than simple medical error or difference of opinion? The pattern is too consistent, too widespread. And it all began after the Horizon acquisition, accelerating dramatically in the past month as revenue targets increased. Melissa closed the folder, pushing it back toward Elena. You need more than patterns to make these accusations stick. You need proof of intent documentation that explicitly connects clinical protocols to revenue goals. That's why I'm talking to you, Elena said simply. You have access to that kind of documentation. Employee complaints about pressure to increase billing, executive communications about revenue targets, the internal evidence that would transform patterns into proof. A flash of something crossed Melissa's face. Fear, perhaps, or recognition. She looked away, staring out the window for a long moment before responding. Do you know what would happen to me if I provided that kind of information? Best case scenario, I lose my job. Worst case, I become unemployable in my field, possibly face legal action for breaching confidentiality agreements. I know exactly what could happen, Elena replied, because it's already happening to me. Fired, reported to the nursing board, potentially blacklisted from my profession. All for doing what I believed was right. And was it worth it? Melissa asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. Knowing what you know now, would you make the same choices again? The question gave Elena pause. She thought about her empty apartment, her mounting bills, her uncertain future. She thought about the fear that woke her in the night, the moments of doubt when the enormity of what she was facing threatened to overwhelm her. But then she thought about Jason, about Mrs. Rodriguez, about all the patients who trusted their caregivers without knowing that financial considerations might be influencing their treatment plans. Yes, she said finally, because some things matter more than job security or professional advancement. Some things are worth fighting for no matter the cost. Melissa studied her for a long moment, as if measuring the sincerity of her words against some internal standard. Then she reached into her purse and withdrew a small USB drive, sliding it across the table with such casual grace that anyone observing would have missed the exchange entirely. I don't know what's on this, she said quietly. A colleague asked me to transfer some files to my personal computer when our network went down last week. I did, and then forgot to delete them afterward. An oversight on my part. Elena understood the game immediately. Plausible deniability. Melissa wasn't giving her confidential information. She was simply being careless with files she shouldn't have had in the first place. That sounds like an easy mistake to make, Elena replied, pocketing the drive without looking at it. Technology can be so complicated sometimes. Indeed, Melissa finished her coffee in a single swallow, then stood to leave. I hope you find whatever you're looking for, Miss Morales, for all our sakes. As Melissa walked away, Elena remained at the table, the weight of the USB drive in her pocket far heavier than its physical dimensions would suggest. Whatever it contained might be enough to bring down Horizon's entire operation at Oak Ridge, to protect countless patients from profit-driven care, to vindicate her own professional decisions. Or it might contain nothing of value, a desperate gesture from someone equally uncomfortable with the status quo, but unwilling or unable to take direct action against it. Either way, it represented hope. And in this fight, hope was a currency more valuable than any other. The small USB drive felt heavy in Elena's hand as she inserted it into her laptop. She'd driven straight from the cafe to Doc Davidson's house, a modest ranch-style home in one of Oak Ridge's older neighborhoods. The living room had been converted into an impromptu command center, with files spread across the coffee table and whiteboard propped against the fireplace, covered in Doc's precise handwriting. Richard Callahan sat at the dining room table, his laptop open and multiple legal pads filled with notes. Mike Taylor paced by the window, his restless energy filling the room. All three men stopped what they were doing as Elena entered, their faces a mixture of hope and apprehension. "She came through," Elena said, simply holding up the drive. "I don't know what's on it, but Melissa made it clear she wants plausible deniability." "Smart woman," Callahan remarked, gesturing for Elena to join him at the table. "Let me take a look. If this contains what I think it might, we need to handle it carefully. Chain of custody will be important if any of this becomes evidence in legal proceedings." Elena handed over the drive, feeling a strange mixture of relief and anxiety. If the files contained what they needed, the real battle was just beginning. If they didn't, they were back to square one with even fewer options than before. Callahan inserted the drive, his expression professionally neutral as he navigated through the files. "Password protected," he murmured, "but using standard Horizon encryption. Give me a minute." His fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency, executing commands that meant nothing to Elena, but seemed to satisfy him. After several tense minutes, he sat back with a low whistle. "Your HR friend delivered," he said. "These are internal communications between Blackwell Hayes and Horizon's corporate leadership. Emails, meeting minutes, financial projections, implementation timelines for the new protocols." Mike moved closer, leaning over Callahan's shoulder. "What do they say? Is it enough?" "More than enough. Listen to this email from Blackwell to the corporate CFO. Implementation of the enhanced revenue protocols at Oak Ridge is proceeding ahead of schedule. Initial projections indicate a 27% increase in per-patient billing, primarily through optimization of medication regimens and diagnostic procedures. Dr. Hayes has been particularly effective at ensuring physician compliance, though we've encountered resistance from some legacy staff, particularly in nursing. We're addressing these obstacles through targeted personnel actions." Elena felt cold rage building in her chest. Targeted personnel actions. That's what they call firing nurses who advocate for their patients. "There's more," Callahan continued. "Detailed breakdowns of which procedures generate the highest reimbursement rates regardless of medical necessity. Quotas for enhanced billing opportunities by department. A tracking system for physicians who fail to meet revenue targets." Doc Davidson, who had been silent until now, moved to look at the screen. "Is there any direct reference to Jason's case or Mrs. Rodriguez?" Callahan navigated through more files. "Not by name, but there are references to high-value cases in the ICU with specific mention of long-term recovery trajectories as prime opportunities for comprehensive intervention packages." "That's Jason," Elena said grimly, "and several other patients with similar conditions. Extended hospital stays, excellent insurance coverage, multiple billable intervention opportunities." Mike's face darkened with anger. "They turned my son into a profit center. Used his injury as an opportunity to run up bills regardless of what he actually needed. And they nearly killed him in the process," Doc added. "The amphotericin was part of their enhanced revenue protocol. Expensive medication with no medical justification in his case." Callahan continued scanning files, his expression growing increasingly grim. "There's a whole section here on managing potential legal exposure. They knew these practices were questionable, at best, explicitly fraudulent at worst. They have contingency plans for regulatory scrutiny, PR strategies for potential negative outcomes, even a fund set aside for confidential settlements." "They planned for patients dying," Elena whispered, the full implications sinking in. "They knew their protocols might harm people, and they set aside money to buy silence rather than changing the protocols." The room fell silent as the magnitude of what they were dealing with became clear. This wasn't just about questionable billing practices or administrative overreach. This was systematic endangerment of patients for profit with full knowledge of the potential consequences. "What do we do with this?" Mike finally asked, his voice tight with controlled fury. Callahan closed the laptop, his decision apparently made. "We take it to the Attorney General. Today. This isn't just an ethical violation or a billing dispute. This is potentially criminal fraud endangerment, possibly even involuntary manslaughter, if we can connect patient deaths directly to these protocols." "Will it be enough?" Elena asked. "Horizon has powerful connections, expensive lawyers." "It will be enough," Callahan assured her. These documents establish clear intent, systematic implementation, and knowledge of potential harm. No amount of legal maneuvering can explain that away. Doc Davidson had moved to the window, gazing out at the mountain landscape that had been his home for decades. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too much suffering, too much injustice. "This was never just about Oak Ridge," he said quietly. "The emails make that clear. We're the test case. If these practices succeed here, they plan to implement them across all Horizon facilities nationwide." "All the more reason to act quickly," Callahan replied. "I'll call my contact at the AG's office, arrange a meeting for this afternoon if possible." As Callahan stepped away to make the call, Elena found herself standing beside Doc at the window. The older doctor's face was lined with fatigue but set with determination. "I always knew medicine was changing," he said almost to himself. "More business, less healing, more protocols, less judgment. But this is something else entirely. This is perversion of everything healthcare should be." "We'll stop them," Elena said with more confidence than she felt. "We have the evidence now." "At what cost, though, your career?" "My retirement security. Mike's faith in the system that was supposed to help his son heal." "Some costs are worth paying," Elena replied, echoing what she told Melissa Patel earlier that day. "Some things matter more than careers or financial security." Doc turned to face her, really seeing her, perhaps for the first time since she'd arrived. "When did you get so wise, Elena Morales? When I met you 2 years ago, you were worried about student loans and overtime pay. Now you're risking everything for a principal." Elena thought about it, trying to pinpoint the moment when her perspective had shifted. Maybe it was always there. Maybe it just took the right circumstances to bring it out. "Or the right mentor," Mike suggested, joining them at the window. "Good people inspire other good people. That's how integrity spreads." Doc smiled, the expression softening his weathered face. "You know, in Korea, I had a commanding officer who taught me that lesson. Young surgeon, barely out of residency, but he refused to evacuate during heavy shelling because we had patients on ventilators who couldn't be moved. Said if the brass wanted to court-martial him afterward, they could if we survived." He paused, his eyes distant with memory. "We did survive. And instead of a court-martial, he got a silver star, and I got a lifelong example of what courage looks like in a medical setting." Elena had never heard this story before, one of the few glimpses Doc had ever offered into his military past. It helped her understand what had shaped him, why he'd spent decades fighting for patients against increasingly business-minded administrators. Before she could respond, Callahan returned, his expression grim but determined. "Meeting set for 4 p.m. at the Attorney General's office downtown. All of us should go. Each perspective is important. Clinical, personal, financial." "What about Jason?" Mike asked. "He's still at University Hospital. I don't want to leave him alone." "I can stay with him," Elena offered. "You three handle the meeting. I'll make sure Jason has someone familiar with him." Mike shook his head. "No, you need to be there. Your documentation of the ICU practices is central to the case. My sister is with Jason now, and he's stable. This is more important right now." The next few hours passed in a blur of preparation. Callahan organized the digital evidence, creating a presentation that showed the clear progression from corporate directives to clinical implementation to patient harm. Doc assembled the medical records that demonstrated the pattern of unnecessary interventions with specific emphasis on Jason's case. Elena reviewed her own documentation, preparing to explain the nursing perspective in terms that non-medical officials would understand. By 3:30, they were ready. The drive downtown was tense, each lost in their own thoughts about what was at stake. For Elena, the reality of her situation kept intruding. Unemployed, under investigation by the nursing board, potentially blacklisted in her profession. But each time doubt crept in, she pushed it aside. This was larger than her personal concerns. This was about the very nature of healthcare, about what happened when healing became secondary to profit. The Attorney General's office occupied several floors of a downtown high-rise. They were met in the lobby by Sarah Chen, a senior prosecutor in the Healthcare Fraud Division. In her mid-40s, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, she led them to a conference room where 2 other officials waited. A man introduced as the chief investigator for the medical board, and a woman from the state insurance commissioner's office. "Thank you for coming," Chen began once they were seated. "Mr. Callahan has briefed me on the general nature of your concerns, but I'd like to hear directly from each of you. Remember that while this is not a formal deposition, everything you say here may become part of an official investigation. For the next 2 hours, they presented their case. Doc Davidson described the clinical patterns he'd observed, the systematic pressure on physicians to maximize billing, and the marginalization of those who resisted. Elena detailed the changes in the ICU, the impact on patient care, and the specific cases that raised red flags. Mike provided the personal dimension, explaining what had happened to Jason and the near-fatal consequences of the profit-driven protocols. Throughout, Callahan guided the conversation, connecting the personal accounts to the documentary evidence from Melissa Patel's USB drive, building a comprehensive picture of corporate malfeasance that seemed to grow more damning with each new detail. The officials listened without interruption, taking notes and occasionally exchanging glances. When the presentation concluded, Sarah Chen closed her notebook with deliberate care. "If even half of what you've presented is accurate," she said, "this represents one of the most significant healthcare fraud cases this office has seen in decades. The combination of documentary evidence and first-hand testimony is compelling." "What happens next?" Doc asked. "We'll need to move carefully," Chen replied. "Horizon Healthcare Group is a powerful entity with significant resources and political connections. Before we can take formal action, we need to verify the authenticity of these documents, interview other potential witnesses, and build an airtight case." "How long will that take?" Mike demanded, his patience visibly fraying. "While you're building your airtight case, they're still implementing these protocols. Patients are still at risk." "I understand your frustration, Mr. Taylor, but rushing into this without proper preparation would almost certainly result in failure. Horizon would tie us up in procedural challenges for years, and in the meantime continue their practices unimpeded." "So we just wait?" Elena asked, unable to hide her disappointment. "Not exactly," Chen said, a hint of steel entering her voice. "There are immediate steps we can take while the larger investigation proceeds. The medical board can initiate a review of specific cases, including your son's, Mr. Taylor. The insurance commissioner can audit Horizon's billing practices at Oak Ridge, and my office can issue preservation orders to ensure no evidence is destroyed." It wasn't the immediate action they'd hoped for, but it was something. A beginning. "What about Elena's nursing license?" Doc asked. "Horizon has filed a complaint with the nursing board, clearly in retaliation for her advocacy." The medical board representative spoke for the first time. "Based on what I've heard today, I'll recommend that complaint be placed on hold pending the outcome of our investigation. The board takes a dim view of retaliatory actions against healthcare professionals who advocate for patient welfare." Elena felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Her license wasn't safe yet, but at least she had breathing room time to fight back properly. "And what about the patients still at Oak Ridge?" she asked. "The ones still subjected to these protocols?" "That's more complicated," Cheney admitted. "Without a formal indictment, we can't directly intervene in Horizon's operations. But the scrutiny of an official investigation often changes behavior. Once Blackwell and Hayes realize they're being watched, they may moderate their practices. Or they might accelerate them," Doc countered. "Push for maximum profit before the hammer falls. People like Blackwell don't surrender easily." "Then we'll need your help to identify specific high-risk situations as they occur," Chen said. "This will be a partnership, Dr. Davidson. Your clinical expertise, our legal authority." As the meeting concluded, Elena felt conflicted. They had been heard, taken seriously, set in motion what might eventually become a significant legal action against Horizon. But the pace seemed glacial compared to the urgent needs of patients still under Blackwell and Hayes' care. Outside the building, standing in the late afternoon sunshine, Doc voiced what they were all thinking. "It's not enough, not fast enough, not decisive enough." "But it's something," Callahan reminded him. "The wheels of justice turn slowly, but they do turn." "Tell that to the next patient who gets an unnecessary procedure or dangerous medication because it generates more revenue," Mike said bitterly. Elena understood their frustration. The system they were fighting moved at its own pace, bound by procedures and protocols, not unlike the medical world itself. But unlike medicine, where exceptions could be made for emergencies, the legal process seemed incapable of responding to the urgency of their situation. "We need to do more," she said finally. While the official investigation proceeds, we need to protect patients directly. How? Doc asked. We've been removed from the hospital. We have no official standing anymore. We have knowledge, Elena replied. We have connections with staff still inside. And we have the most powerful tool of all, public attention. Mike nodded slowly, understanding dawning. The press. If patients and families knew what was happening, they'd demand changes immediately. Exactly. No hospital can function without public trust. If that trust is compromised, they'll have to respond regardless of what the official investigation is doing. Doc looked skeptical. Horizon has a substantial PR department. They'll spin any accusations, paint us as disgruntled former employees with an axe to grind. Not if we have irrefutable evidence, Elena countered. Not if we can connect specific protocols to patient harm in ways even non-medical people can understand. The USB drive, Callahan mused. It contains enough to make a compelling public case, even without the legal determination of fraud. Would that compromise the official investigation? Mike asked. Possibly, Callahan admitted, but Chen already has copies of everything, and sometimes public pressure can accelerate official action rather than impeding it. They stood in silence for a moment, each weighing the risks and benefits of taking their fight public. It could backfire, certainly. Horizon could sue them individually for defamation. The official investigation might be complicated by media attention. Their own reputations could be further damaged in the inevitable counterattack. But the alternative, waiting weeks or months while more patients were subjected to profit-driven protocols, seemed unacceptable. I'm in, Doc said finally. At my age, reputation is less important than doing what's right. Me too, Mike agreed. After what they did to Jason, I've got nothing to lose. Callahan sighed but nodded. I'll help navigate the legal implications. Make sure we stay on the right side of defamation laws while still telling the truth effectively. Elena felt a surge of determination. This was the right path, whatever the personal consequences. Then we need a plan. Strategic release of information, coordination with sympathetic journalists, protection for any current staff who might support our claims. And we need to move quickly, Doc added, before Horizon realizes what's happening and prepares their counter-narrative. As they walked toward their cars, Elena felt a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration. They were charting a new course now, moving beyond official channels into direct advocacy. It was risky, unpredictable, potentially devastating to their personal and professional lives. But it was also right, unquestionably, undeniably right, in a way that transcended conventional calculations of risk and reward. This was what her grandmother would have called standing in your truth, the willingness to accept any consequence rather than compromise on fundamental values. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the Rocky Mountains sharp against the blue Colorado sky. Elena had barely slept, her mind racing with plans and contingencies, doubts and determinations. By 6 a.m. she gave up on sleep entirely, making coffee and reviewing the documents they had prepared for release to the press. Callahan had worked through the night, selecting the most damning evidence from the USB drive while carefully removing anything that might identify Melissa Patel as the source. Doc had written a detailed explanation of how the Horizon protocols endangered patients, translating complex medical concepts into language laypeople could understand. Mike had contributed a powerful personal statement about Jason's experience, the human cost of profit-driven healthcare. Elena's own contribution was a chronology of the changes she'd observed in the ICU, specific examples of compromised care, and the ethical dilemmas faced by nurses caught between institutional demands and patient welfare. Together, the documents told a compelling story of systematic prioritization of profit over healing, corporate values displacing medical ethics. At 8 a.m. her phone rang. It was Mike, his voice tight with controlled urgency. Elena, something's happening at Oak Ridge. My sister's friend is a technician in radiology. She says there's some kind of security situation. Code Silver. Elena's blood ran cold. Code Silver. Active shooter. The exact scenario they had discussed during that ill-fated staff meeting weeks ago when Elena had raised concerns about the reduced security staff and inadequate emergency protocols. Do you know anything else? We're in the hospital, near the main entrance apparently. The hospital is in lockdown, but communications are confused. Some saying it's a drill, others saying it's real. I'm on my way, Elena said, already reaching for her keys. What, Elena? No. If it's a real situation, you can't go there. I still have friends inside, patients I care about. I can't just sit here and do nothing. She ended the call before Mike could argue further, grabbing her purse and rushing to her car. The drive to Oak Ridge took 20 minutes normally. Elena made it in 12, running several yellow lights and taking shortcuts through residential neighborhoods. The scene at the hospital was chaos. Police cars blocked the main entrance, their lights flashing silently. A perimeter had been established, keeping bystanders and media at a distance. Ambulances stood ready, paramedics waiting for patients who might need evacuation. Elena parked several blocks away and approached on foot, her heart pounding. As she reached the police perimeter, she spotted Doc Davidson arguing with an officer, his face flushed with frustration. I'm telling you, I worked in that hospital for 30 years. I know the layout, the protocols, the staff. I can help. The officer remained impassive. I understand, sir, but we can't allow civilians inside during an active situation. Please step back behind the line. Elena reached Doc's side, touching his arm gently. What's happening? Do we know anything for sure? Doc turned, his expression shifting from anger to relief at the sight of her. Elena, thank God, it's real. Armed individual in the main lobby. Reports of shots fired. At least one wounded security guard. Who is it? Do they know? No official confirmation, but rumors saying it's James Reeves. Former lab tech fired 6 months ago for drug use. He made threats at the time, but the hospital reduced security anyway as a cost-cutting measure. Elena remembered the discussions during staff meetings, the warnings that had been dismissed as excessive caution. Now those warnings had become reality, and people were in danger because Horizon had prioritized the bottom line over basic safety. What about the ICU? Any word from inside? Nothing specific. All units are in lockdown according to protocol. But Elena, you know as well as I do what that means for critical patients. If power is compromised, she knew exactly what it meant. The backup generators would activate automatically, but only if the control systems functioned properly. With reduced maintenance staff, another Horizon cost-cutting measure, there was no guarantee the systems would work as designed. We need to get inside, Elena said, determination replacing fear. They won't let us through, Doc replied, nodding toward the police line. Elena scanned the building, remembering her years working within its walls. The service entrance on the east side is connected to the main hospital through the basement corridor. If the police are focused on the main entrance, Doc followed her gaze, understanding immediately. It might be unguarded or at least less heavily secured. But Elena, this is dangerous. If this Reeves character is still active inside, then patients and staff need all the help they can get, especially from people who know the building and have medical training. Their eyes met, a moment of silent communication between two people who shared the same fundamental values, the same definition of duty. No words were needed. They circled the building carefully, staying out of sight of the police perimeter. The service entrance was indeed less heavily guarded, with a single officer standing watch, but approaching directly would still be impossible. The maintenance tunnel, Doc whispered, pointing to a nondescript door set into a retaining wall 30 yards from the service entrance. It connects to the basement mechanical room. Used to be the emergency evacuation route before they remodeled. Will your old key cards still work? No, but I know the manual override code, assuming they haven't changed it in the last month. They moved quickly, keeping low and using parked vehicles for cover. The door was exactly as Doc remembered, hidden behind an overgrown shrub and marked only with a small, authorized personnel only sign. Doc punched a sequence into the keypad beside the door, his fingers moving with the certainty of long practice. For a moment, nothing happened. Then with a soft click, the lock disengaged. Some things never change, Doc murmured, relief evident in his voice. Maintenance has been using the same override code since 1987. The tunnel beyond was dimly lit and smelled of damp concrete, the utilitarian passage never meant to be seen by patients or visitors. They moved quickly through the darkness, Doc leading with the confidence of someone who had traversed these hidden pathways many times during his long career at Oak Ridge. The mechanical room should be just ahead, he whispered. From there we can access the main basement corridor, then take the service elevator to the upper floors. Assuming the elevators are still functioning, Elena replied. If they've cut power or implemented a full lockdown. Then we use the stairs. Either way, we get to the ICU. The mechanical room was deserted, its banks of equipment humming steadily despite the crisis unfolding above. A good sign, power systems were still operational, which meant life support in the ICU should be functioning normally. Doc moved to a wall-mounted panel, entering another code that gave him access to the hospital's internal emergency system. A small screen illuminated showing the status of various hospital zones. Main lobby still unsecured, he read. First floor, north wing unsecured. All other areas in lockdown protocol. He studied the display further. No power disruptions reported. Backup systems on standby but not activated. Elena felt a small measure of relief. The situation was contained to the entrance areas and critical systems remained functional, but the crisis was far from over. What's the quickest way to the ICU from here, she asked. Service elevator to the third floor, then through radiology to the east stairwell. That puts us just down the hall from the ICU entrance. They moved with deliberate haste, balancing the need for speed against the danger of making noise that might attract attention. The service elevator hummed softly as it carried them upward, the normal hospital sounds muted by the lockdown. When the doors opened on the third floor, they found the corridor empty, the radiology department eerily silent without its usual bustle of staff and patients. As they approached the east stairwell, they heard voices. Hushed, urgent, frightened. Doc held up a hand signaling Elena to stop. They listened, trying to determine if the voices belonged to staff, law enforcement, or potentially the shooter himself. Standard lockdown procedure, a woman's voice said, tension evident in every syllable. Secure all patients, barricade doors, lights off, no movement until all clear. But the ICU patients, a male voice responded. If the power fails, the battery backups only last 20 minutes. The main generator controls are in the hallway outside the secure zone. Elena and Doc exchanged glances. They recognized the second voice. Dr. Williams, one of the few physicians who had openly questioned Hayes and Blackwell's protocols. I'll check the generator controls. A third voice volunteered. I can get there and back in under a minute. Absolutely not, nurse. Protocol is clear. No one leaves the secure area under any circumstances. The third voice belonged to Dr. Hayes herself, Elena realized. Even in a crisis, the Horizon administrator was prioritizing adherence to protocol over potentially life-saving action. Doc stepped forward, pushing open the stairwell door. Three figures stood in the hallway. Dr. Williams, Dr. Hayes, and a young nurse Elena recognized from the medical floor. All three turned startled by the sudden appearance of intruders. Davidson. Hayes recovered first, her surprise quickly replaced by anger. What the hell are you doing here? This is a secure area during an active emergency. We heard about the situation, Doc replied calmly. Came to help with critical patients in case of power failure or other complications. You're trespassing. Both of you. I'm calling security immediately. Good luck with that, Elena said. Last we heard, security was dealing with an armed individual in the main lobby. I think they have higher priorities than enforcing your trespassing complaints. Dr. Williams stepped forward, relief evident on his face. Thank God you're here. We've been debating the generator controls. Protocol says stay locked down, but if power fails, then patients die, Doc finished. Ventilators fail, monitoring systems go dark, medication pumps stop. Protocol be damned, we need to ensure the backup systems are ready to activate if necessary. Hayes moved to block their path. This is still my unit, Davidson. Your hospital privileges have been revoked and Nurse Morales has been terminated. Neither of you has any authority here. This isn't about authority, Elena replied, her patience evaporating. It's about patients who might die if critical systems fail. Are you really going to let that happen to protect your precious protocols? Before Hayes could respond, a sound echoed through the hospital corridors, the sharp crack of gunfire closer than before. Everyone froze, the immediate danger overshadowing their professional disagreement. He's moving through the hospital, Dr. Williams whispered, getting closer to patient care areas. All the more reason to follow protocol and stay secured, Hayes insisted, though her voice had lost some of its certainty. Doc turned to Elena, his decision made. I'll check the generator controls. You get to the ICU, assess the patients, help organize the staff if evacuation becomes necessary. I'm going with you, Elena said firmly. The controls are in the main hallway exposed to potential threat. 2 sets of eyes are better than 1. Hayes started to protest again, but Doc cut her off. We're not asking permission, doctor. We're informing you of our plan. Stay here if protocol matters more to you than patients. We're going to do what needs to be done. Without waiting for a response, Doc and Elena moved toward the ICU entrance, leaving Hayes sputtering ineffectually behind them. Through the reinforced glass doors, they could see staff and patients within the unit. Of lights dimmed, according to lockdown protocol, but equipment still functioning normally. Generator controls first, Doc said. Then we assess the ICU situation. They moved cautiously into the main corridor, the space eerily empty without its usual traffic of staff, patients, and visitors. The generator control panel was mounted on the wall about 30 yards away, a small electronic interface that could mean the difference between life and death if main power failed. As they approached the panel, a sound from the far end of the corridor stopped them cold. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, unhurried. The methodical pace of someone who had a plan and all the time in the world to execute it. Elena pressed herself against the wall, Doc beside her, both holding their breath as they peered around a support column toward the source of the sound. A man was walking slowly down the hallway, dressed in dark clothing, a rifle held casually at his side. Even at this distance, Elena could see his face clearly. James Reeves, former lab technician, now armed and dangerous within the hospital that had once employed him. The generator controls are still 20 feet away. Elena whispered, her voice barely audible, even to Doc standing inches away. If he sees us, we wait, Doc replied, equally quiet. He's moving away from the ICU toward the administration offices. Once he passes that intersection, we move to the panel, check the systems, then get into the ICU. They watched, hardly breathing, as Reeves continued his methodical progress down the corridor. As Doc had predicted, he turned at the intersection, heading toward the area that housed executive offices, including Blackwell's and Hayes' private domains. Now, Doc whispered once Reeves was out of sight, quickly but quietly. They moved to the generator panel, Doc entering his access code with practiced efficiency. The display illuminated, showing the status of the emergency power systems. Primary generator ready, Doc read. Backup systems primed. Automatic transfer switch functional. We're good for now, but I'll set it to manual activation as a precaution. His fingers moved across the keypad, implementing the changes. There. Now we can trigger the backup systems manually if needed, regardless of what happens to main power. Let's get to the ICU, Elena said, already moving toward the secure doors. They had almost reached safety when they heard the footsteps returning. Reeves had completed his circuit of the administrative wing and was heading back toward the main hospital areas. There was no time to reach the ICU doors before he would spot them. The supply closet, Doc whispered, pulling Elena toward a door set into the wall a few feet away. They slipped inside just as Reeves rounded the corner, the small space barely large enough for both of them among the shelves of medical supplies. Through a small gap in the door, they watched as Reeves paused in front of the ICU entrance, studying the reinforced glass doors with the calculating gaze of someone assessing a target. He raised his rifle, aiming it toward the patients and staff visible within. In that moment, Elena understood with perfect clarity what she had to do. There was no time for debate, no opportunity to weigh options or consider consequences. There was only the absolute certainty that she could not watch patients and colleagues die while she remained safely hidden. Stay here, she whispered to Doc. Call 911, tell them exactly where he is. Before Doc could respond, Elena stepped out of the supply closet, positioning herself directly in Reeves's line of sight between him and the ICU doors. James, she said, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her. Put the gun down. Reeves turned, startled by her sudden appearance. For a moment, confusion crossed his face as he tried to place her. Then recognition dawned. The ICU nurse, he said. You're not supposed to be here. You got fired like me. I came back because people need help, Elena replied, keeping her voice calm, maintaining eye contact while acutely aware of the rifle still pointed vaguely in her direction. Just like you need help, James. This isn't the way to solve whatever problem you're facing. They destroyed my life, Reeves said, his voice eerily conversational, despite the weapon in his hands. Fired me for using once, just once, after my wife left. Said I was a danger to patients. Reported me to the licensing board. Made sure I couldn't work anywhere else in healthcare. Elena nodded, taking a small step forward. That's wrong. They shouldn't have done that. But these people in the ICU, they didn't make that decision. They're patients who need care staff who are just doing their jobs. Blackwell made the decision. Hayes supported it. They're the ones I want. Reeves tightened his grip on the rifle, his eyes darting toward the administrative wing. But they're not in their offices, hiding somewhere probably, like the cowards they are. Then this isn't the place to look for them, Elena said, taking another small step forward. She was fully exposed now, nothing between her and Reeves except 15 feet of empty corridor. Let these patients be. They're already suffering enough. For a moment, it seemed to be working. Reeves's expression softened slightly, the rifle lowering a fraction of an inch. But then a noise from within the ICU, a monitor alarm, a door closing, something innocent but startling, refocused his attention on the unit. They're in there, he said suddenly, raising the rifle again. They have to be, hiding with the patients, using them as shields. No, James, they're not in there. I was just inside checking on patients. Blackwell and Hayes aren't there. The lie came easily, a necessary deception to protect those within the ICU. But Reeves wasn't listening anymore, his focus entirely on the doors ahead, his finger moving to the trigger. Elena had one last card to play, one final effort to prevent the imminent tragedy. She stepped directly into his line of fire, placing herself between Reeves and the ICU entrance. If you want to shoot in there, she said quietly, you'll have to shoot me first. Time seemed to slow. Elena could see every detail with unnatural clarity. The sweat on Reeves's forehead, the slight tremor in his hands, the conflict in his eyes as he processed her words. Behind her through the reinforced glass, she could see nurses moving patients away from the doors, creating what little protection they could within the confines of the unit. In that suspended moment, Elena thought about Patronus's again, about conjuring protection from your happiest memory. Her Patronus would be this moment, this choice, this absolute certainty that some things were worth any sacrifice. Move, Reeves said, his voice strained. I don't want to hurt you. Just them, the ones who destroyed everything. I can't do that, James. These are my patients, my colleagues. I won't let you harm them. The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but sudden movement at the far end of the corridor shattered the fragile equilibrium. Doc Davidson emerged from the supply closet, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. James Reeves, he called, his voice carrying the authority of decades in medicine. This isn't who you are. You were a good lab tech, a valuable member of our team. Whatever they did to you, this won't make it right. Reeves swung the rifle toward this new threat, his focus diverted from Elena in the ICU. Dr. Davidson, what are you doing here? They fired you too. They did, and like you, I'm angry about it. But this isn't the answer, son. These people behind these doors, they're innocent. They're just trying to survive, just like you and me. Doc was moving slowly down the corridor as he spoke, his hands still raised, his gaze never leaving Reeves's face. Elena realized what he was doing, drawing Reeves's attention away from the ICU, creating distance between the gunman and the vulnerable patients. They're not innocent, Reeves argued, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. They're part of the system, the same system that threw us away like garbage. Some of them maybe, but not all. Not the patients fighting for their lives. Not the nurses working double shifts to provide care. Not the techs and orderlies and support staff just trying to make a living. Doc had reached the midpoint of the corridor, now still advancing slowly toward Reeves, still drawing him further from the ICU. Elena remained where she was, understanding that her role now was to protect the unit entrance if Reeves attempted to return. It's too late, Reeves said, his voice breaking slightly. I've already hurt people. That guard in the lobby, I didn't mean to. He just got in the way. It's never too late to stop, to make a different choice. Doc replied, now just 10 feet from Reeves. I've seen men come back from worse, much worse in my time. The guard will recover. No one has died. You can still walk away from this with your conscience intact. The moment hung suspended, a fragile balance between violence and redemption. Elena could see Reeves wavering, the rifle lowering slightly as Doc's words penetrated the fog of rage and despair that had driven him to this point. Then from the administrative wing came a new voice, sharp, authoritative, entirely wrong for the delicate psychological equilibrium Doc had established. Drop the weapon immediately. Armed security, drop it now. A private security officer, part of the skeleton crew Horizon had maintained, despite budget cuts, had entered the far end of the corridor, his own weapon drawn. The sudden escalation shattered the moment of potential surrender. Reeves raised his rifle, swinging it toward the new threat. Everything happened in a blur of motion and sound. The security officer fired. Reeves returned fire. Doc lunged forward, whether to tackle Reeves or push him out of the line of fire, Elena couldn't tell. And then silence broken only by the soft thud of bodies hitting the floor. Elena moved without conscious thought, running toward the tableau of fallen figures. The security officer was down, a bullet wound to his shoulder. Reeves lay motionless, a spreading crimson stain on his chest. And Doc Davidson, who had spent his entire career saving lives, was now fighting for his own blood, pooling beneath him from a wound that had caught him in the crossfire. Doc. Elena knelt beside him, her nursing training taking over as she assessed his injury. Gunshot wound to the upper chest, likely lung involvement, massive blood loss already evident. She pressed her hands to the wound, trying to stem the flow, knowing even as she did so that it might not be enough. Doc's eyes found hers remarkably clear, despite the trauma his body had suffered. "Elena," he whispered, his voice weak but steady. "Get to the ICU. Patients need you. They have other nurses. You need me now." Doc's hand found hers, his grip surprisingly strong. Always the advocate, always putting others first. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Knew you were special from day one." "Save your strength," Elena urged, hearing footsteps approaching rapidly from both directions. SWAT team members from one end, medical staff emerging cautiously from the ICU at the other. "Listen to me," Doc insisted, his voice fading, but intense. "What we started, the case against Horizon, you have to finish it. For all the patients they'd sacrifice for profit. Promise me." "I promise," Elena said, tears blurring her vision as medical staff surrounded them, taking over Doc's care with practiced efficiency. "But you're going to be there when we win. You're going to see it through with us." Doc's eyes closed, consciousness slipping away as the trauma team worked to stabilize him. Elena stood back, allowing them space, her hands and scrubs covered in his blood. A SWAT officer guided her gently away. Asking questions, she answered mechanically, her mind still with Doc, with the promise she had made. The next hours passed in a blur. The hospital moved from active crisis to recovery mode. Reeves was pronounced dead at the scene, the security officer stabilized and expected to recover. And Robert Davidson, physician, mentor, and hero, was rushed to surgery, his condition listed as critical but stable. Elena found herself in a quiet waiting room, still wearing her blood-stained clothes, surrounded by familiar faces. Mike Taylor had arrived as soon as the lockdown lifted, leaving Jason's side at University Hospital to support the man who had risked everything to protect others. Callahan was there too, making calls, coordinating with the Attorney General's office, ensuring that the day's events were properly documented as part of their larger case. And to Elena's surprise, Melissa Patel had come as well, having heard about the crisis on the news and recognized the names of those involved. Her professional reserve had cracked, revealing genuine concern and unexpected courage. "I've resigned from Horizon," she told Elena quietly, "effective immediately. And I've agreed to testify about everything I've witnessed, everything I provided to you. This madness has to stop." "That's a big risk," Elena replied. "After what happened today, the risks of staying silent seem far greater. James was a good person before Horizon destroyed him. I processed his termination papers myself. His manager fought for him, wanted to give him treatment and a second chance, but Blackwell overruled everyone, said we needed to set an example." Her voice broke slightly. "Now look what's happened." As they waited for news from the operating room, Elena realized that something fundamental had shifted. The crisis had laid bare the consequences of Horizon's policies in ways no amount of documentation or testimony could have achieved. James Reeves, while responsible for his own actions, had been a product of the system they had created, a system that discarded people when they became inconvenient, that prioritized profit over human welfare, that sacrificed safety for the sake of the bottom line. The evidence they had gathered, combined with the day's dramatic events, created a narrative too powerful to ignore or dismiss. Already news crews were gathering outside the hospital, reporters piecing together the story of corporate greed, patient endangerment, and individual courage that had culminated in today's tragedy. Mike sat beside Elena, his weathered face lined with concern, but also with a strange kind of peace. "Jason's asking about you," he said. "About Doc. Wants to know if you were both okay." "What did you tell him?" "The truth. That you're the bravest people I know, and that because of you, a lot of patients are safe today who might not have been otherwise." Elena thought about Jason, about the long road of recovery still ahead of him, about Mrs. Rodriguez and Mr. Patterson, and all the other patients who had been viewed as profit centers rather than human beings in need of healing. "It's not over," she said quietly. "Not by a long shot." "No," Mike agreed, "but the battle has changed. After today, Horizon can't hide behind corporate statements and legal maneuvering. The world is watching now, and what they're seeing isn't pretty." A surgeon appeared at the door, still in operating scrubs, his face showing the fatigue of hours in surgery, but also a cautious optimism. "Dr. Davison is out of surgery," he announced. "The bullet missed his heart but damaged his lung. He's lost a lot of blood and recovery will be long, but barring complications, he should make a full recovery." The relief in the room was palpable. A collective exhale of breath held too long. Doc would survive. The physical wound would heal. But the deeper wounds, to the institution of healthcare, to the trust between providers and patients, to the fundamental values that should guide medical practice, those would require more than surgical intervention to repair. As the day faded into evening, Elena found herself standing at the window of Doc's recovery room, watching as the mountains caught the last light of the setting sun. Mike had gone to check on Jason, promising to return with updates. Callahan was still coordinating with officials, ensuring that the day's events were properly integrated into their larger case against Horizon. Doc lay still, connected to monitors and IV lines, his breathing assisted by oxygen, but steady and strong. He looked older in repose, the lines in his face deeper, the silver of his hair more pronounced against the white hospital pillow. But there was also a peace about him, the serenity of someone who had faced a moral test and emerged with his integrity intact. Elena pulled a chair close to his bedside, taking his hand in hers. The fingers that had performed countless surgeries, that had saved innumerable lives, lay still in her grasp. But there was warmth there, life, and promise of recovery. "We'll finish what we started, Doc," she whispered, though she knew he couldn't hear her through the sedation. "We'll make sure Horizon answers for everything they've done. And when you're ready, you'll be right beside us when we rebuild healthcare the way it should be. Patient-centered, value-driven, true to the oath we all took." 3 months later, Elena stood at the back of a crowded courtroom, watching as Thomas Blackwell and Victoria Hayes were led away in handcuffs, their bail revoked after new evidence emerged of attempts to intimidate witnesses. The Attorney General's investigation had moved with unprecedented speed, fueled by public outrage and a steady stream of whistleblowers from within Horizon Healthcare Group. Former employees, emboldened by Melissa Patel's example, had come forward with years of documentation showing systematic fraud, endangerment, and in at least 2 cases, deaths directly attributable to profit-driven protocols. The charges were extensive healthcare fraud, conspiracy, reckless endangerment, obstruction of justice, and in Blackwell's case, involuntary manslaughter. The Horizon board had tried to distance themselves from the scandal, firing both executives and pledging reform, but they too faced regulatory consequences in civil lawsuits from patients and families. Elena's nursing license had been fully restored, with a formal apology from the state nursing board acknowledging that her actions had been in keeping with the highest standards of the profession. The medical board had issued similar findings regarding Dr. Davidson, whose recovery had been slow but steady. He was back on his feet now, using a cane and still undergoing physical therapy, but already consulting on a state-level commission established to draft new regulations protecting healthcare whistleblowers. As for Elena, she had found a new purpose in the aftermath of the crisis. University Hospital had offered her a position not just as an ICU nurse, but as director of a new patient advocacy program designed to ensure that care decisions remain focused on outcomes rather than billing opportunities. Her first hire had been a promising young therapist who worked specifically with patients recovering from traumatic injuries, a position created with Jason Taylor in mind, though open to all who needed it. Jason himself was making remarkable progress. The experimental treatments that University Hospital had approved, treatments Horizon had deemed not cost-effective, were showing promising results. He had regained significant function in his lower extremities, and was now walking short distances with the aid of specialized braces. His goal, he told Elena during their weekly reading sessions, they were now working through Dune, was to walk across the stage at his high school graduation next year. Outside the courtroom, reporters gathered around the small group of whistleblowers and patient advocates who had brought the Horizon case to light. Mike Taylor had become their unofficial spokesperson, his military bearing and straightforward manner, making him particularly effective on camera. Today is just the beginning, he told the assembled press. The real victory will come when we transform our healthcare system back into what it was meant to be, a sacred trust between healers and those who need healing. Not a business, not a profit center, a calling. Elena slipped away from the crowd, making her way to where Doc Davidson waited in a courtyard cafe across from the courthouse. He looked better than he had in weeks, some color returning to his face, his eyes clearer and more focused. "Did they ask about your next move?" he asked as she sat down across from him. Elena smiled. "Always. They want the dramatic arc, nurse turned whistleblower turned reformer. Makes for a better story." "And what did you tell them?" "Oh, the truth. That I'm going back to work tomorrow, that my patients need me, that the real work of fixing healthcare happens one person at a time, one day at a time." Doc nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. "That's my girl." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching as life flowed around them. People hurrying to appointments, couples walking hand in hand, a mother comforting a crying child. The ordinary moments that made up a life that might someday require the intervention of healthcare professionals who hopefully would value healing above profit. "You know," Doc said finally, "when I was in Korea, I had a commanding officer who told me something I never forgot. He said that medicine isn't just about applying scientific knowledge. It's about standing in the gap between suffering and healing, between despair and hope. Standing firm no matter what." "Sounds like someone I know," Elena replied. Doc smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Sounds like someone I know, too." As they walked back toward the parking garage, Elena felt a sense of completion, of having come full circle. The battle wasn't over. Institutional change never happened quickly or easily. Horizon Healthcare Group was just one company among many, and the forces that had corrupted it remained active throughout the system. But something had shifted. A line had been drawn, a standard raised. And Elena Morales, who had once been just an ordinary nurse, worried about student loans and overtime pay, had found her true calling. Standing in the gap, holding the line, protecting the sacred trust between those who heal and those who need healing. Outside, the Colorado mountains stood eternal against the horizon, witnesses to human triumph and failure alike. The winds of change were blowing, and for the first time in too long, they carried the scent not of profit but of hope.